Then there's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. California may be exceptional in many ways, but it's going through some heartbreaking and perilous times as the summer of 2020 unfolds. For nearly 3 months, the state and the country have been shut down and shut in by a pandemic, with COVID-19 laying bare, among other things, our society's long-standing racial disparities, with communities of color showing greater health and mortality impacts from the virus and its devastating effects on the economy. But then comes the viscerally shocking killing of George Floyd on the streets of Minneapolis in the last week of May. His death follows that of Breonna Taylor, an African-American woman shot 8 times inside her home, and Ahmaud Arbery, killed while he was jogging in his neighborhood. And those killings of African-American citizens are just the ones we've heard about in the last few weeks. As one African-American woman said recently, it's either COVID killing us, the economy killing us, or cops killing us. And the timing and viciousness of George Floyd's death, captured on those 9 minutes of brutal video, have been the catalyst for immense reaction and anger that have been on a scale not seen in our country and state collectively in maybe a generation. But this particular demonstration and protest feels different. The same pleas repeated in the wake of racial violence of the past, but in 2020 those pleas are now demands. And those demands for justice have resonated in solidarity around the world and have somehow managed to push the daily details of an international pandemic to the bottom of the fold. On this edition of Then There's California, we'll reflect on the vigilance and persistence and the lessons of racial equality that we have failed to learn from again and again in this country and in this state, in a society that boasts of having the most robust democracy in the world, but one whose fruits and benefits come at the expense of many of its own citizens. We'll also talk about the civic unrest and political and social reckoning that is now being demanded by communities of color all over the world, and this time the streets are filled not just by the representatives of those communities who are usually siloed front and center in their uprising, but by newfound allies and partners, white, gay, old or younger, who are uniting with their brothers and sisters of color in their cries of one humble but powerful request: stop killing us. State Senator Stephen Bradford represents the 35th Senate District from Gardena in Southern California. He is the vice chair of the Legislative Black Caucus, and he is the chair of the Select Committee on Boys and Men of Color. He was the first African-American elected to the Gardena City Council. He's a former state assemblyman and is a longtime community and legislative leader. Senator Bradford, welcome back to Then There's California.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
How you doing?
I'm doing well. How you doing?
I don't know how I am. I'm doing fine, all things considered.
All things considered, that's for sure.
It's been an extraordinary couple of weeks. Give me some reflections in your mind on the events of the last week in May and this week as we speak, and the impact that the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis had on not only this state, but this country.
And not only this country, but this world. You see the impacts internationally now. And what we've experienced over the last 2 weeks is, in many ways, deja vu all over again for the African-American community. The tragedies of Mr. Floyd losing his life is nothing new at the hands of police for African-Americans throughout this country. But what is different, we hope, this time is the number of folks who have expressed their outrage, and what we witnessed a little over a week ago was straight-out murder. It was no different than a lynching in the 1800s, early 1900s that African Americans have experienced from the time they've been brought to this country. So I think it's an awakening for many folks around this country.
You were a very young man, but you remember the protests after Martin Luther King's death in the 1960s. You remember the Rodney King riots. You remember during this last decade Michael Brown, Eric Garner. But many of the observers of the protests and the actions of the past week believe that the dynamics of these events that have unfolded are actually more profound in a certain way than the past. Perhaps that has to do with COVID, the economy stresses. The world economies can be shut down during a pandemic, but racism apparently cannot.
That's so true, and I think it's a much more profound response than what we saw in 92, even in many ways in 65. It was more concentrated. This is now organized, it's coordinated from the peaceful protesters as well as those folks who want to loot and rob and destroy. It's organized, and it's mobilizing not only across this country, but around the world now. What we've learned in this, or seen in this pandemic, is the role that race has played as well. And it's all culminating to this, and this is just a boiling point. We've seen where African Americans and Latinos are infected at a higher rate. They're dying at a higher rate because of COVID. They can't shelter in place like our more affluent brothers and sisters. We saw where this disease initially impacted the more affluent communities, but once they were able to shelter in place, once they were able to stay at home and not have to go to work, their numbers went down while African Americans and Latinos went up because they were the frontline essential workers who were working in our grocery stores, driving our trucks, driving our buses, and moving people around, cleaning our hotel rooms and things of that nature. And these folks were dying at a higher rate and being impacted. And again, race was at the center of it. And it's at the center of, again, the distant learning that African American and Latino kids are facing now with schools shut down. It's races again where testing is not available. We have testing deserts. We have medical deserts where, again, COVID has shown that. And now with the death of Mr. Floyd, it's just further added insult to injury and has pulling the scab off a sore that's been festering for 400 years in this country.
As a person of color, as a leader in your community, how does one live in such a time? What happens in your bones? What's going on inside?
It's tough, and it's real painful to continually have to internalize and deal with this, but also carry on a positive face for the rest of the world, because if we let this anger get at us, we're often deemed the angry black man, the angry black person. But we have reason to be angry. We have reason to be disappointed. We have reason to just give up hope. But we know that won't solve the problem. So it's a painful time, but it's nothing new. And that's the real sad part about this. We've seen this act far too many times, and I hope we're at a point, I should say, that we've said enough is enough. It's time for radical, transformative change in America. And I think that's what I'm trying to project, and I think that's what we all need to project at this point, that it's time to really do something different.
During the civil rights movement, protesters practiced nonviolence, but were regularly met with violence. But it has actually been that violence, sadly, Bloody Sunday in Alabama, Martin Luther King's assassination, even up to Eric Garner, that's actually spurred the action. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, the repeal of stop and frisk laws in various cities.
And that is sad commentary that, yes, violence has kind of like awakening those folks who have been asleep and being naive to believe that it is bad as African Americans have always said it to be. But at the same time, it's been that violence that's been the catalyst for us to say we've had enough and we have to respond back. Yes, to have dogs and hoses sicked on you, to have a president now who used the military and tear gas to displace peaceful protesters simply to do a photo op. It's enraging, it's insulting, but at the same time, it spurs that activism in a lot of folks who say, I'm sick and tired of being pushed around, and we're going to push back.
This generation is still dealing with what past generations have dealt with. There was a sign at a protest we've seen in a photograph that circulated over the last week that said, I don't want to have to come this far by only coming this far.
Yes. I think it speaks again to the history of this country to continue to push and knock at the door only to be pushed back, and it seems like you start all over again, to come this far along and still reflect back and say, golly, have we really made progress? So it's at a point right now, I think people are not willing to retreat anymore, and I think it's going to be a constant move forward to bring forth, again, radical change here in America.
Let's talk about the video that we have all seen over the last week or so. the 9 minutes of the officer holding his knee on George Floyd's neck. You saw it with the rest of us. What were your reflections on it?
I was saddened. I was heartbroken. I was moved to tears. I'm mad. But at the same time, I'm not surprised. But what hurts me the most is that I've seen folks respond to animals being treated less harshly and responding and saving them, but seeing an African-American man die right there on a public street, and 4 officers were as callous and as cold and as heartless. Again, it would have been more people enraged about killing a dog than some people were about their knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for 9 minutes.
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar has said, you start to wonder if it should be all black people who wear body cams and not the cops. If it wasn't for that video, the cops probably would have gotten away with it.
Without a doubt. I mean, we've had the Rodney King example. We've had Mr. Scott's example. We've had Michael Brown, Gardner. Richard Pryor used to have a routine, and he was caught having an affair. And he says, are you going to believe me or your lying eyes? And many times America doesn't want to believe what they see, and it's right there in front of your face. But we have been conditioned not to believe the truth and saying you're lying, your eyes are lying to you. But no, our eyes are telling us the truth through videos, through all that is being captured with eyewitnesses there. We're seeing how vicious and cruel some folks, not all folks, in law enforcement are when it comes to African Americans.
But aren't the communities to some degree in kind of a double bind with this video? You need the video footage to convince white America that what is happening is real and that your reactions are understandable, and yet that footage at the same time gets replayed on every cable channel, gets replayed on everybody's phone. It becomes this stuff of spectacle, almost like this, if you'll pardon the expression, this racial violence porn that we're always watching. We need this video, but gosh, to see it, it becomes such a spectacle.
It is painful when you just see it played over and over and over and over again. And in many ways, it adds insult to injury. Because, again, if roles were reversed and that had been a white suspect and a black guy, you would have need to see it only one time for justice to be meted out. I mean, in that same police department, 2.5 years ago, an African-American officer by the last name of Noor shot an unarmed white woman at night because he feared for his life. The same response that most officers say. He was not only immediately fired, he was charged with murder, and he has since been convicted of murder. Maybe because he was African-American and he was a Muslim, but they seem to met out justice a lot quicker. Mr. Noor's shooting was not on video.
You have written very eloquently about the nearly unchecked ability of law enforcement to act with impunity in the oppression of black bodies and taking a black life. Now, I would be derelict in my duty to not point out that there are so many people in the law enforcement community who are supportive, whose hearts are as broken as everyone else's about what happened in Minneapolis and what has happened in other cities over the years. They are taking a knee with your community. But having said that, you have said America doesn't really have a problem with law enforcement because the status quo works out pretty darn well for white America. Folks have confidence in law enforcement and the way they're handling things.
That's true. I mean, we have great allies, white, Asian, Latino in law enforcement, who are appalled by what they saw. But the overall institution of law enforcement in this country has always overwhelmingly favored white America. That's how this whole system was set up. I grew up in a middle-class household. Both my parents were college educated. My father was a businessman. My grandparents were business people. We did not come from a poor family. But the conversation that we had in relationship to law enforcement was far different than my white friends that I grew up with. And it wasn't because we were more inclined to commit a crime. We knew law enforcement was more inclined to stop us, harass us, treat us more harshly than our white counterparts. So we were trained at an early age to comply, say yes, sir, no, sir. Don't make any quick moves. Where my white friend says, what's your name? Give me your badge number. Do you know who my mom and dad are? Boom, 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 boom. And I used to shiver when I was in a car with some of my white friends and the way they talk to police officers, and we never did that. So there are good, there are bad, but the overall system, again, they say, I had a lot of my white friends says, why do they run from the police if they haven't done anything? I says, if you feared something, you would run as well. We don't hate the police. We fear the police. You guys don't fear the police. Your encounter is not likely to lead to an arrest, lead to some harsh treatment, and unfortunately lead to death. So our reaction to law enforcement is far different than our white counterparts.
And I know this extends also to the legal system, the way the legal system to some degree protects law enforcement who brutalize or kill other people under the badge of duty. And they so seldom end up actually facing consequences. Now, we've heard stories today as we speak that the officers that have been charged in the murder in Minneapolis are being accused of second-degree murder, all of them. But years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court started articulating this notion of qualified immunity, that police do not have to face legal liability for enforcing the law in good faith and with probable cause. It's a high burden of proof, but any violation of rights has to be clearly established, and that is a difficult curve to mount.
Without a doubt. I mean, it's a standard that is almost impossible to detect when you talk about law enforcement and their far reach. As we say, there's something called the rule of law, and then there's the color of law. And law enforcement has great leeway in their interpretation or their coloring of law and how they choose to apply and interpret versus what's black and white. What's black and white is always applied to, again, folks other than people of color. But when it comes to people of color, law enforcement has great leeway. They have almost no accountability in many ways. Again, and even when a officer is found to be out of department protocols and procedures, and even if it leads to firing, 46% of them get rehired to another department. And less than 10% are ever charged, and of that 10%, even less are ever convicted. So it is a high burden of proof, and many times that's why a lot of African Americans don't even call the police, because they know even when they're right, they're usually wrong.
There's been an argument circulated that the only way that we're going to stop the endless cycles of violence is by creating alternatives to policing. I'd be interested in what you think about this. Reducing the power of police and their contact with the public. Invest the money that's spent on policing programs and training into alternative emergency response programs. For example, instead of police responding to emergencies involving substance abuse or domestic violence or homelessness or mental health, it would be the healthcare workers, the social workers, or emergency response teams that would handle these incidents. And then the money spent on policing goes to other resources. As a lawmaker, what do you think of that?
I agree. I mean, I think our priorities have been wrong. From investing more in mental health. My mother was a psych nurse, and she used to tell stories of the majority of people who came into the psych hospital who were arrested were more on drugs and needed help, but these guys were arresting these guys simply because they had an addiction problem or they had a psychological problem, and they were falling victim because they didn't know how to deal with it. So I think we do need to invest more of those resources for more of the social service side of society that helps folks along. Look at what other countries have done. I mean, we're the most overly policed nation in the world, and you don't see anarchy in all these other countries, because even in parts of Great Britain, they don't even carry, bobbies don't even carry guns, and you don't have the mass shootings, you don't have none of the crimes that we see over here. So I think we do have to re-examine policing in America. And if we understand, again, our history, why we're advocating for ethnic studies and black history here in the California legislature, if we understood the growth of law enforcement, it happened directly after slavery in this country.
Yes.
That's the growth of police departments. And you see it, and they grew in urban areas where blacks were populating. And it was a direct response to how do we control these people. From 1872 on, you saw a burgeoning of law enforcement and police departments all across this country.
You know, that you bring up an interesting point. In so much of the reading that I have done over the last few years, realizing how much of our infrastructure, figuratively and literally in this country, is based on racist attitudes or does have its roots during a time of slavery. And you've just pointed out another example is the history of law enforcement.
Use of deadly force that we reformed here in California last year. Dr. Weber's bill, AB 392. Use of deadly force was implemented in California in 1872. What happened in 1872? That's 7 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, and California figured we needed to give law enforcement the right to use deadly force. It was no increase in crime in California. It was black folks who were coming to California who were now free people, and it gave them another legal right to kill us. And that's the reality of it.
Let's talk about the protests. I know I've asked you your reflection on everything that's happened. You've watched the protests. You've seen them in your own cities. You've seen them out here in Sacramento. The National Guard are standing outside our buildings right now. A good many cities in California are on curfew right now. Obviously, you've seen it in the past. What do you think now?
It's encouraging, but at the same time, it's troubling when you see folks with automatic assault weapons standing on your corners. You would hate that it has come to this, but what is most encouraging about the protests? It's diversity.
Yes.
It's tapestry of all Californians, all Americans who are fed up and are sick and tired of being sick and tired. So that's far more encouraging to me than what we saw in 92 when the predominantly folks who were rioting and protesting were African Americans, and 65, after the Watts riots. This is a real tapestry of diversity because folks are really sick and tired of it. I'm empowered by what I see, the number of young people who are out there right now letting their voices be heard and stopping some of the folks with ill intent. Even coming out, I saw this morning walking into the Capitol, two white young ladies with Black Lives Matter T-shirts on, but they had a broom and a shovel, and they were cleaning up. They were literally walking down the street, bending down on their knees, picking stuff up, because that's not the image that they wanted to leave. And they didn't leave that cigarette butt, but they were cleaning up the city.
So you believe that it is compelling people to the angels of their better nature
without doubt. This
do good things.
This protest has been, again, an awakening for some, a rebirth, so to speak, and a change of heart, and allowing folks to know that we're all in this together. And again, it's young and old, rich and poor, moving, again, the world. I mean, you see protests now in Australia. You see protests now in the UK. People have seen this. They've seen enough, and it's mobilizing people like never before.
And yet there's a lot of people who would otherwise align with the community's outrage and the support and even join the protests when they see the looting, however, and the property damage that has even happened here in Sacramento. They just think, wow, that is hurting their cause. They are discouraging people from hearing their message. How do you get the message across that the black community has spent generations fighting institutional racism and doing all of the conventional things to raise awareness and to get the attention and action that the community needs, and that sometimes it takes fire and shattered windows and chaos to get people's attention?
Good question. I mean, do I condone the violence and the destruction of property? No, but sometimes it requires that kind of reaction sometimes to some of the violence and oppression that we've seen. Dr. Martin Luther King says the riot is the voice of the unheard, and sometimes you have to do things. I've always stated you have to show up, stand up, speak up, and sometimes show out. And some of the folks are now showing out. And just letting you know that we're sick and tired of this. But at the same time, a lot of the folks who are doing the damage are not the peaceful protesters who are not trying to pass that message on of let's have constructive change through legislation, through changing the will and the heart of minds. And there's kind of a subterfuge to, again, take us off message and confuse us and take it away. See, there you go again. They're violent. They're tearing things up. But again, I will come back to our historical standpoint. Even if that were the case, and if we were using the looting and the rioting to get our message across, We learned it from white America. When you look at what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, when the KKK was let loose on the entire black community.
I understand the anniversary of that was this weekend.
Yeah, we just this past weekend on June 1st. Next year will be the 100th anniversary, but I guarantee you ask most people, they don't know the history of that.
Right.
Because it's been buried for almost 80 years, and they just started talking about it in the last 20 years. Over 300 black folks lost their life. They were decapitated in the street. This was a total black town. What people always says, what do you have? Why don't you build your own? They did. They had movie theaters. They had banks. They had doctors. There were lawyers. There's homes, the churches. It was a complete black community. And white America says, we've had enough. We're going to destroy this.
Let me further the discussion on this, the other perspective that is coming through, giving you an example. The other night here in Sacramento, the office of my optometrist was vandalized and looted here in downtown Sacramento. She's an Asian American doctor of optometry. She's been around for 30 years. She actually, in fact, works downtown with folks who need optical care and eye exams. And again, you could say because of the strides and the progress that have been made, thanks to communities of color over the last decades, she was able to be a doctor. She was able to open her own business. She has become an innocent bystander of this. She is not the problem. How do you reconcile, and I say this with all respect, how do you reconcile the anger that everyone feels and the understanding of the protests? And again, we do acknowledge that there are people who are here to not be in the best interest of the protesters. How do you reconcile businesses, communities being innocent bystanders to a problem that they are not part of and in fact are trying to make better?
By helping them rebuild, by doing what we're saying, like seeing the young folks out, black, white, whatever, helping clean up, helping to stop. We've seen enough folks over the last week or so who are literally stopping looters, standing out in front of buildings and saying, no, this is not what it's about. And have they been able to save all the businesses? No, but there are clearly folks out here who are saying, no, this is not why we're here. We don't want to see this. And we need to continue with that message of saying, property destruction is not the answer. This is not our goal and objective here. We want social and political change in America. We don't want destruction, and we can achieve it by having a collective voice. And again, just reaching out, and once she's back, this doctor's back open, going out and supporting those businesses, just like we saw in 1992 in L.A. It was plenty of black folks who says, no, you will not burn this community drugstore down because they have been here for this community, and it was Asian owned, and they stood out in front and protected businesses. So I know it's hard for those folks who are innocent bystanders in all of this. We saw it in LA, we saw it in Santa Monica, where a guy, he had a museum of sort for the Santa Monica community with all kind of crystals and rocks and stuff for educating kids, and his building, business was just ransacked for no reason. And it was, he says, what he had in there was of no value to most of the people. But again, it was some of the folks who were there to throw folks off, because again, there are black folks who are there about destruction, as well as many white folks who were there just for destruction, because they've seen through their arrest records that it's some right-wing extremists that have been out there, as well as some left-wing extremists that have been out there as well.
Indeed. And California is not the enlightened island of open-mindedness that many people think it is. It's taken a lot of blood and grief, as you have even mentioned, to get all parties to the table to make reforms. You talked about AB 392, for example, and how that has affected and benefited the community here in California since the bill was signed into law. And its presence, how has it been relevant, say, in the last 6 months since it became law? And in recent weeks, too, as the police met the protesters, have we seen some, from your perspective, seen some significant impact as a result of that becoming law?
I think it's a little too early to tell the impact that it's had, but I think we've seen through the outreach of law enforcement officers' willingness to take a knee with the community, show solidarity, shake hands, look people in the eye, and not come with this, authoritarian position all the time of I'm right, get out the way. We've seen movement. And again, it's too early to see if some early data has shown that incidents with law enforcement have gone down from a negative perspective of use of force, but I think it's still too early. But I think what we're seeing here in California, that there is a shift. There's a willingness to change.
You and your colleagues on the Legislative Black Caucus announced this week, in the wake of everything that's going on, a dramatic legislative portfolio that includes legislation that would address affirmative action, voting rights, and also, and this is particularly profound, begin the process to consider reparations in California for the institution of slavery. Mm-hmm. Not a new notion in this country or not a new debate, but talk about what you and your LBC colleagues want to do.
I think reparations is one of the many broken promises to the African-American community. That was part of the Emancipation Proclamation. It's plenty of black folks who constantly state, we're still waiting on our 40 acres and a mural.
Right.
You know, our Japanese brothers and sisters have found reparations from some of the harsh treatment they received during World War II. Even our Filipino brothers and sisters who fought along Americans in World War II and in the Vietnam War have gotten reparations and compensation. African Americans who have toiled in the field for over 400 years are still waiting for reparations. And we know the harsh effects of Proposition 209 that was passed almost 30 years ago, and the impact that it's had. And people say, well, we should be a colorblind society. We should, but we're not. Right. And when you look at the corporate boards in California, and the very few that even have minorities on these corporate boards, you look at the Zuckerberg with Facebook and his, I want to say, lack of diversity and sensitivity to what's going on right now with how Facebook is being used. And he's saying, oh, well, that's not our role to kind of like play politics. Well, yeah, you got a platform like that. Your voice needs to be heard. But if you have no history of equal rights and inclusion, so to speak, and diversity in your workplace and in your corporate boards, then you're not sensitive to the greater need for diversity in contracting. That's why we work so hard, even with SB1, the gas tax, to make sure that there were a diversity component in contracting and procurement. And we have an inspector general whose sole role is to make sure women-owned, minority-owned, disabled veterans get contracts and business out of this. So diversity is key, because we've seen the impacts of 209 and the exclusion of black businesses. And people say, well, why don't you have your own? Well, we would love to have more of our businesses, but some of the discriminatory practices, you're having fewer and fewer black businesses. So I think 209 will help us move in that direction. Some of the more police reform measures that we're championing too will help us as well in that direction.
Even though this is a Democratic Caucus podcast, I try not to make it so drippingly partisan, but I cannot ignore the conversation about the President of the United States, and this is not being partisan, the glaring inadequacies and tension. As a lawmaker yourself, as a member of the Legislative Black Caucus and a senator here in California, what's your perspective and reaction to what is going on at the White House and the national level?
It's a shame. It's an abomination. It's an insult to anyone who considers themselves a leader, a statesperson, an elected official. There's nothing morally just about this individual. And people say, oh, it's because he's a Republican. Some of my best friends are Republicans. Right across the hall is Senator Brian Dolly from Northern California. His district goes all the way to the Oregon border. He's one of my closest friends. So party has nothing to do with leadership, has nothing to do with just decency. And this guy has fueled more hatred and animosity and division than anyone I have ever met in my adult life, bar none. He is unfit for office, and he has stoked more hatred. And when he says he's the greatest president ever, in ways he might be true based on the foundations of this country, and it was founded on racism. So if that's the foundation of which this country has been, he has represented it far better than any president in the history of the United States. If that's the core of who we are, he has represented it quite well. So
you have said that if our white brothers and sisters here in 2020 are to fight against racism, then it is not enough for them to simply say that they are not racist or that enslavement was long ago, why are we worrying about this now? I read Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, provocative book. He clarifies the distinction between being non-racist and anti-racist. He says the problem with being only non-racist is that it signifies neutrality, but that there really is no neutrality in the racism struggle. To be anti-racist is a radical choice in the face of this history, and he says we don't have to be fearless like Harriet Tubman to be anti-racist, but we have to be courageous. That is quite a leap for a lot of white Americans, but it was an extraordinary education for me to read that. What are your thoughts about that?
Couldn't say it better myself. You have to. It takes courage. If you want change on any level, in any aspects of life, it takes courage. You have to stand up. As I said, it's not enough to stand up. You got to speak up, and you got to be willing to rock the boat, and you got to be willing to call out your friends, call out your family members, call out your colleagues. Again, my family was the first black family on my street. From elementary school to middle school, my best friends were white kids. And I know in their heart they weren't prejudiced. But some of their parents were. Some of their grandparents were. Some of their friends were. And many times they were silent on checking them on that. And even though we got along great, they went home and said, oh, my mom and dad, you can't come over because they don't, you got to push back. And as a kid, I don't expect a kid to do that, but we now have to speak out on this. Mm-hmm. And far too many people are quiet and they're silent, saying, oh, that's not in my heart, but you're not checking the person who has it in their heart.
There's that song from the Broadway play South Pacific. You have to be carefully taught. You have to be taught to hate, to have prejudice in your heart. What can we do to continue educating young people who are not born with racist tendencies, but they are taught? What do we do to create a purity of thought and an openness of their heart of the young people?
Ethnic studies would be a good start. And truly teaching American history. Not the sanitized, whitewash version, but true American history. And we haven't done that. And that's why, again, the Black Caucus is fighting so hard for ethnic studies to be part of the curriculum for graduating out of college, because so few people, when we started talking about the Tulsa Massacre, we were having black folks who called and said, oh, I never knew about it. And I'm not, I know you don't. I mean, you didn't. It's so much in this country that we don't know about because it's been sanitized, it's been buried. And especially when it comes to race, people always say, let's not talk about that. Oh, or especially when you talk about, again, African Americans and what we went through. Oh, that was so long ago. We didn't own slaves, yada, yada, yada. But the remnants of that is still affecting people today. So I think education in the household, because as you stated, we're not born racist. You're only born with two fears in life when you come into this world: loud noises and falling. Everything else is taught.
On that point, I ask this question with humility, sitting here talking to you. How can the rest of us be stronger allies to the communities of color? We are as disappointed and as angry as the communities are about what is happening. And as you say, you have seen a diversity out there in the protests. And we want to do the work of anti-racism and be in solidarity with anybody who's at the margins. But obviously there are a lot of us who have not lived through the fears and anger, and we don't have the generational background compelling us. We feel compelled to act or stand in solidarity, but too often at times it feels like many of us are trying to show up 300 years late to the oppression, saying that we care about the world, but it all just feels like words and it doesn't seem like it resonates, and so we pull back. How do we fully try and share in the experience and stand next to our brothers and sisters of color and learn and build from it, not only for their journeys, but for ours?
Again, using your voice and going outside your comfort zone, being willing to take a different view of life and say, okay, no, I haven't walked in their shoes, but let me go out and try to experience some of the things. Let me shadow somebody for the day. But again, living out, it's not enough to espouse what you believe. It's now time to live it out and demonstrate it. And I'm going to say, yes, this is a democratic podcast, I think the Democratic Party has to do a much better job. They can't continue to fly the flag of racial equality and justice, and sometimes they're the quickest ones to cut and run. So if you want to claim it, you got to own it, and you got to fight for the change that you really say this party's about. So.
Well, the communities of color, the African Americans, they are proud Americans. That is the bitter irony in all of this, is that African Americans, blacks in this country, have believed and still believed in this country really with a faith that it doesn't deserve. They have seen the worst of this country. They have felt the worst, pushing forward to find the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that the Founding Fathers intentionally excluded them from.
That is a great irony, because when you talk about being an American and being a patriot, I think African Americans are the best example of that. I mean, to be enslaved and go fight in the Civil War, to be segregated and live through Jim Crow laws and fight in World War II, even though you were in segregated units and, were treated just deplorably, to be on the front line of the Vietnam War and come home and can't find a job. Stevie Wonder had a song, we were on the front line, but we're on the back line when it comes to getting ahead. And we've been there. And whenever America has asked us to stand up, we have been there. And we've signed up, and we said, hey, we're ready to go. But America has not been there standing side by side. So America needs to look at itself in the mirror. And I hope, again, this is an awakening. It is time for them to look themselves in the mirror and say, who's really been here? And not to say we're any better, but we're surely no less. We're surely no less. And until we can live out to that creed, all men are created equal, because we are, but we're not treated equal. We're not treated equal. And until we are treated equal, we're wasting our time with all of this. I mean, we're going to continue to have the resurrections and the disruptions of society and the continued frustration and division. And we're too good of a country for that. And it's time to change that attitude.
I'm going to hold up the mirror to that very eloquent answer to ask you this final question. One can only wonder on this day in June 2020, after everything that has happened just in the last week or two, how we're going to survive all of this. Governor Newsom said the black community's lost patience because they've had promise after promise for decades, and that we don't tear out institutional racism, he said, we prune. The work of justice truly is holy work. It is work of the better angels. Will this searing experience, in your mind, Senator, help us work together to recognize and figure out how to do the right thing, to live together differently in a new America? And as I say this, it sounds like just lofty prose. Or is it just going to be the streets settle down, the National Guard goes home, and it's lather, rinse, and repeat? And how can we give a voice to calm and change the intense and entrenched racism? Now that is a huge...
That is.
No pressure, Senator. But seriously, going forward with this from this day and this hour, what happens?
Again, I hope a change of heart. Again, we can't legislate the radical change that this country needs, but we can examine what's working in all these other countries. We can take a deeper look at ourselves to say, where are we falling short on being more receptive and being more open and being more tolerant? You had a guy occupying the White House that steps outside on the street and holds up a Bible that he's probably never read in his life. We're beyond symbolism. We're beyond theatrics. We've seen enough of that. Now we need substantive action. And you ask, can we do it? Yes, we can. We can change. Will we do it? I don't know. But we're capable of transforming this country. We're capable of improving race relations in this country. It's a question of, are we willing to do it? Are we all willing to take that courageous step and say, hey, the time is now, and if not now, then when? If not me, then who? We're at that point.
Beautiful way to wrap this up. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Bless you for your candidness and your honesty. I know this has been an incredible time, a tough time for the community, but I think all as a global community, we are in solidarity. And I hope that bears fruit in some way in public policy and in social attitudes moving forward. So thank you, sir, for your time here.
Thank you. And programs like this is going to help us along and, move this thing along our way. So we appreciate having this voice here.
Amen, and I hope so. Senator Steve Bradford from the 35th Senate District from Gardena, California. He is the vice chair of the Legislative Black Caucus here in the California State Legislature, and that wraps us up for Then There's California. We're a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus, with technical assistance and great ideas from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, Rainier Seveniano, Gunshan Patel, John Roman, McLeana Woods, Lisa Murphy, Faith Colburn, and the graphic design talents of Tim Davis. On behalf of State Senator Stephen Bradford from Southern California, I'm Brian Green, wishing everyone justice and safety and peace of mind. And thank you for listening to Then There's California.